Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Wilkes, and it is my pleasure to welcome you in my capacity as director of the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies. Before saying more about the occasion that has brought us together today, I want to acknowledge that those of us in North America are on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Alabama Cushada, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Qualuitecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. Thank you all for coming to the first Black Religions and Spirituality Day hosted by the Warfield Center and curated by Jade Evans, graduate student in religious studies at UT Austin and recipient of a mentoring fellowship from the Warfield Center. Thank you also to Warfield Senior Program Coordinator Christina Bryant for handling event logistics and publicity, among other important tasks, and to Graduate Assistant Alex Cunningham for providing tech support and ensuring that things are running smoothly on Zoom. I look forward to a day of engaging discussion about Black spiritual practices as sources of community, sustenance, and well-being. Without further ado, I'll hand the virtual stage to Jade, who will moderate our first session, Spirit Possession, Conjure, and Black Jesus, African Diasporic Religions and Caring for Black Bodies. Jade?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilkes. And thank you first to our panelists who I will introduce, and also to all of you, our audience, for tuning in either live or by way of the recording. The purpose of this segment of Black Religions and Spirituality Day is to encourage dialogue that takes seriously the role of African diaspora religious experiences, knowledges, and practices in the healing, wholeness, and wellness of Black bodies. So we've brought together an array of voices to model the type of connection between academy and community that such conversations requires. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. The first panelist that we have is Nyria White. Nyria is a historian in training and a hoodoo devotee, as well as a full spectrum doula. She is a master's student in the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. Our second panelist is Chicago native, Iya Naila Akinyemi Senkova. She is a prolific interdisciplinary visual artist, fashion accessories and furniture designer, published writer, poet, dancer, choreographer, entrepreneur, and traditional ritual specialist. Our third panelist is Dr. Khytie Brown. Dr. Brown is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at UT Austin. She is an ethnographer and scholar of African diaspora religions and African African Studies. And lastly, we have Dr. Brandon Jones, Dr. Brandon Jones serves as the Minister of Students at the Greater Mount Zion Church in Austin, Texas. Dr. Jones also works as Associate Director for Student Learning and Development in Housing and Dining, as well as he teaches in the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. Thank you so much to each of our panelists for joining us and contributing to this conversation. And as the conversation builds and develops, I invite you to engage each other in this discourse. I'm gonna ask if our tech team would put the extended bios into the chat for our audience to see as we begin our discussion. And then after a certain amount of time, we will open up the conversation to accept questions from our audience that have been submitted through the Q&A portal down below. Let's begin. My first question is for Nyria, our historian in training. Nyria, my question has to do with your work as both a hoodoo devotee and a doula. How has midwife ancestral knowledge guided you? How has midwife ancestral knowledge been significant in your own experiences for caring for Black female bodies in particular?
Yeah, first, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I really sat with them for a while to really, try to hone in specific things, because I feel like Black midwife ancestral knowledge has really shifted my way of thinking about my work as a doula and my work as a hoodoo devotee. So their profound knowledge completely shifted my understanding of my personal religious practices, my approaches to caring for Black birthing folk, and my appreciation for plant medicine. These women birthed our entire existence on this continent. Our culture, our resilience, our magic was literally birthed into their hands. White psychosis and the medical industrial complex has attempted to erase them from the narrative of this country. So I think it is especially important to honor them in every way that we can. So I'll just give three main principles that I've learned from them that has guided my work. So the first is to have an unwavering faith in spirit. So spirit can be broad, it can be a lot of things, whatever makes sense for you and your practice, right? But a majority of the Southern midwives were devoted to a Christian faith, like most other Black folk. As many of you know, or you may be learning, Black Christian practices in the United States is an intricate melding of indigenous African religious practices, as well as traditional Christianity. And these midwives use a variety of tools to be successful in birth. Things such as the Bible to bring strength and peace to their clients, herbs to augment birth progression, and even axes, which were thought to cut the pain of labor. However, regardless of the tools that they had, when they arrived in the birth space, they relied fully on the power of spirit to guide them through the mystifying journey of childbirth. And in my own doula practices, I make it a point to uplift our Black midwife ancestor, to allow their knowledge and their faith to flow through and ground me while I support my clients. So that's the first thing. Second thing is their commitment to community. Midwives were called to assist in childbirth, but they were also relied on to treat and heal their communities. In the 19th and 20th century, many rural areas did not have access to white professional medicine, right? And so they relied on the knowledge of midwives to heal their ailments. Midwives were their doctors, were their therapists, and were a vital pillar in the health and resilience of the Black community. Black women, whether we're birth workers, teachers, mothers, etc., we continue to do this work today to uplift our communities where society fails us. And I think that these midwives are a great common ancestor that we can look to show us a care model to support our communities. So yeah, commitment to community. Number two. The third thing, last thing, is their honor of earth medicine. So midwives use more than plant medicine. They relied on the earth to provide them with the tools to heal and provide, the wind to blow away sickness, the earth to nourish, the plants that healed our ancestors' bodies. And midwives' knowledge and respect for earth medicine is undoubtedly honorable. And in my own practice, I strive to spread their knowledge of plant medicine to heal our community, mind, body, and spirit. So yeah, those are just three things, but I think, their unwavered, support, their unwavered commitment to healing. And it's just such an honorable and such a magical thing to watch and to read And I'm just like so excited to spread their knowledge and their presence into the birth space, especially when it comes to helping Black birthing people. And then your second question, how is ancestral knowledge significant for caring for the Black female body in particular? So this question I sat with for a while. And while, you know, midwife cared predominantly for women, I think that their model of care stems from a system that's a lot more broad, right? So I kept thinking about Charlotte Fett's book, Working Cures. In this book, she discusses the impact of Black healers on the Southern plantation and the system of care they created to heal their community members. These healers understood that healing in itself was more than the physical, right? It's a matter of spirit, and you know, the matter of physical spirit is equally important. So midwives, root workers, herbal doctors care for their communities holistically, attending to the mind, body, and spirit of an individual. So their knowledge combined ancestral customs of healing from their West African roots in combination with an expansive understanding of plant medicine. And I believe that this holistic care model and belief is vital in truly healing and supporting Black female bodies, especially around womb care and childbirth. I believe midwives understood the female body as like a portal, right? Even more so during pregnancy, our bodies are not only carrying a child, but also allowing the spirit of that child to flow in and out throughout gestation. And because of this, the female body needs to be treated in a particular type of care to prevent illness of the body, of the mind, and of the spirit, even after the baby is born. And there are a few practices that stick out to me that I think show their commitment to holistic care. One of which is a practice called fussing. Fussing is a commitment to pampering a pregnant person by rubbing and massaging with oils, combing and wrapping their hair, washing the birthing person with the intention of relaxing the birthing person before labor. And this practice is also believed to call the baby spirit back into the parent before labor. Midwives knew that labor was a time when both the birthing person and the child moved closer to that space between the physical and spiritual world. And thus they took special precautions to keep everybody safe. So we also see practices such as belly binding to close the wound, which is a portal to close that portal, herbs to treat mother and baby for common postpartum issues, and various other traditional practices meant to protect from illnesses of all types. So I think as Black midwives were pushed out of the birth space in the 20th century, that's where we start to see those dramatic increases, unfortunately, in mortality in Black birthing people and infants. Midwives knew how to treat Black women because they were Black women, right? They knew how to support their communities and did so by caring for Black people holistically as our whole selves and not just our physical selves. And I think for myself in my practice, but the implementation of these practices, like the ones I've mentioned before and many, many others, I think implementing those practices, prioritizing ancestral knowledge and combining it with, our access to evidence-based research, we can really see dramatic changes in the experience for Black birthing folk entirely.
Thank you so much, Nyria. And as we continue to go on, please, our attendees, go ahead and insert some questions that you have for Nyria and for our other panelists as we continue to go forward. Thank you again, Nyria. And I am gonna turn now to Ianaila. I have a question for you about your 2019-2020 solo exhibition here in Austin at the George Washington Carver Museum entitled Ala Ashe, Messages Within the Conjure. we're going to share a photo. I have to check, make sure we can still do that. Actually, we might not be able to, but even if not, I would love for you to share, what does this exhibit, what did this exhibit represent to you? And what does it suggest about the relation between West African spiritual traditions and care for Black bodies across the diaspora?
Oh, okay. Hetep, greetings, Asante Sana, Michawo, Karo, hey Karo. Just greeting everyone, Akwaba, in our different ancestral languages. And which piece did you want to share? Because I may have it right here to pull up. If you can describe it, I can pull it up.
Actually, if you have it on your, do you have it set up on your desktop already?
Yeah. I just don't know which one you want.
Whichever one would be preferred by
Oh,
you. So go ahead and share your screen. Does that
okay,
work?
cool. Yes, I'll do that right now. And sorry, just have to remember where I put it. Okay, there it is. Okay, so this is sort of a, I'm not sure if this is the one you want. Can you see it?
Yes, this is perfect.
Okay. So basically your first question, what did Alashe, messages within the Conjure, mean to me? It meant a lot of things. So basically Alashe, or Alashe, depending on pronunciation, is a Yoruba word for someone, a person who is able to manifest and make things happen. So basically another way of saying conjure, right? Or hoodoo, gree, all of the terms that mean our African diaspora, spiritual. I don't like the word magic, because what we do is magical, but it's not magic because it's more than that. And so not only is that the description for the title of the show, but it's also a title that is given to folks who can make things happen. So I happen to be also an Alashe. And so putting these energies and these works together for this exhibit, using multiple mediums, because I am multidisciplinary, meaning I work in different mediums, often at the same time. And those mediums could be painting, or two-dimensional work, drawing, pen and ink, clay. I'm also a metalsmith, happen to be one of 6 Black female metalsmiths in Austin. If there are more, I don't know who they are yet. And I also include performance in my work. So I'm a dancer choreographer, as mentioned about from my bio. And this work was important, this body of work, and I'm still creating pieces for it because it's considered a living exhibition or a series. So as I create works, especially for an exhibit, they go up in the midst of the exhibit until finally we kind of stop. So that if you attended the exhibit at the Carver Museum 2019, 2020, then you would have come one day or one week, and then you would have seen new pieces or pieces evolve. And so, so this piece in particular that's on the screen is Makosa, Nightcrawler of My Dreams. So in my spiritual cultural work as a ritual specialist, I'm responsible for, one of my duties is roles as being responsible for creating implements that are used in rituals and ceremonies, or just, you know, the the implements or the adornments that you see, not just in Yoruba Ifa tradition, but in other West African traditions as well. So I make those things, even the garments that are worn for ceremonies. I also am responsible for, as a healerist, I make herbs and medicine and heal folks as well, both the physical body and the spiritual, mental, emotional aspects of who we are. And so for the exhibit, I was charged with putting what I do as a devotee of our different African ancestral traditions into the work, from whether it's the title to the actual imagery that comes forth, to even how I prep my materials. Sometimes I may use consecrated water to mix my paints or inks or the surfaces of the pieces. I have to be in a certain state of mind or spirit when I'm working on certain pieces, especially for doing ritual work. And so each of the pieces in the show are elements of that those processes and the communications that I have with the spirit realm. Because a lot of times I'll have a sketchbook full of things to create and that I'm working on, or to keep me on track with my my work. And I'm sorry, and I'm kind of going in and out of the spirit realm right now, so communicating. So a lot of times I may have a specific thing in mind, but then I'm guided someplace else in that process. So a piece may be in my sketchbook one way and then end up becoming and being actualized as not something maybe completely different to the visual eye, to the human eye, to the perception, but for me, from the spirit as well. And so yeah, so there's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of guidance from the spirit realm, my ancestors and ancestresses especially, sometimes other folks, and the spirits of the space may inform the works even in the process of installing them. So and then my exhibitions, like I said, always have some performance element in them as well. Okay, and the second question, I'm sorry, I don't remember the second question.
Yes, that's okay. Just speaking to maybe how this exhibit gets at this idea of caring for Black bodies across the diaspora.
Right. I want to find another piece while I'm talking about that. So as a healerist, so I come from a long line of root women and in alignment with Sister, was it Khytie? That's the, yes. Yeah. All of my mothers, my mother, I'm the youngest of 9. My mother was the last daughter of 11, and then her mother 22, and my grandmother lived to be from 1876 to 1986. So, excuse me, 1874 to 1986. So listen to the, do the math. So Mississippi on the plantation, or even though we were supposed to be free, still on the plantation, all of my mother, my grandmother, my great grandmothers, and so on, they were root women, they were midwives. I was the only one born in a hospital. And the only reason I was born in the hospital in Chicago was because I wasn't coming. So I was about to turn into an 11th month baby. So they had to bring me out. I wasn't coming. I didn't want to come. It was January, it was winter, it was Chicago. I didn't want to come. So all of that growing up and watching my mother do everything from providing salves and teas and fixing cuts and wounds. And then our neighbor, who was also a nurse, who did even more extensive sort of like surgery in the neighborhood. I grew up watching that. So it's really, really important that the aspect of healing Black bodies, both spiritually, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, etc., is like breath for me. So it just comes with the territory. So how can we be these phenomenal warriors and warrioresses and these, Blacknificent people that we are in all of the realms that we find ourselves in, and then not heal this body or have a strong body, because we are not able to do anything without this tool. This is a machine and it has to be taken care of. And knowing that divine forces like Ogun or Ogu or Bena, Heru Behudet, all of those synchronizations of Ogun in our ancestral traditions. Ogun governs our immune system. It's not just the god of war and metal and the architect of society, but governs our immune system. So thinking about that, and possessing that divine force within us as a people, and being able to access that and other divine forces that govern other systems in our bodies, we are walking manifestations of divine power to heal and be healed and to rejuvenate if we tap into that. And having folks and things in our community and the works that are created, whether for the body and their utilitarian or their aesthetic, those are elements that are brought forth in the work that I do in relationship to healing us, because they're meant to be visual reminders as well as spiritual conduits to remind us that we have the ability to heal ourselves from within our cultural traditions, whether it's the cloth that we wear, the jewelry, the adornments, to the things that we look at. And I'll finish with this quote by Leopold Senghor, who it guides everything that I do with my work. The artistic image is not intended to represent the thing itself, but rather the reality of the force the thing contains. So my work is a representation of the reality of the forces that are in nature within us as a people in the universe. And especially as Black women, our wombs, our bodies, yes, they are vessels, but our wombs are sacred portals to and from the spirit realm.
Wow, thank you so much, Ian Aila. And again, to our attendees, please, please, please go ahead and put questions into the Q&A segment of the Zoom. And let's switch gears a little and talk with Dr. Khytie Brown. Dr. Brown, and actually I'm gonna ask Naila, if you wouldn't mind to stop the sharing of your screen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so Dr. Brown, in your research, on Revival Zion in Jamaica and Panama, at least two concepts seem to be central. The first being this notion of Afroqueer, and the second is the notion of spiritual journeys. What do these concepts mean for our audience, and how do you explore them in your research? Also, how can either of these concepts inform our understanding of how Black bodies are to be cared for via African diasporic religions more broadly?
Thank you so much, Jade. So I'm going to actually go ahead and share my screen in true ethnographer fashion. I just have like a brief presentation with a couple of video clips and a picture that I wanted to share with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Perfect. So I'll just leave it like this. Okay, great. So really, Revival Zion, which is the religion that I study, is an African diaspora informed Christianity that's practiced within Jamaica and sort of within its Panamanian diaspora. And local perceptions of this religion sort of conflated with obia, which is sort of this practice of witchcraft. And more recently, it has garnered a lot of scorn because of its association with queer men. And in order to really understand Revival Zion religion, you must really understand that the religion is two things. It's cosmopolitan and it's Afro-queer. So practitioners are able to tap into other worlds through a somatic ritual known as journeying, where they enter a trance state that's induced by distinct drum beats or by a certain kind of percussive breathing, coupled with this rhythmic bending and bowing of the body that's known as drilling, trumping, or groaning. And so during these trance journeys, practitioners are able to travel to spiritual lands where they're either passers-by or they're stationed in these spiritual lands. And thus, for the duration of their life, they maintain spiritual citizenship in these nations and in these spiritual lands. So the research that I do really rests upon two analytics, Afro-queer and the idea of geospirituality. And so geospirituality emphasizes this orientation towards spiritual journeys, and Afro-queer articulates the fluid, multi-sensual, and multi-dimensional Africana modes of being and doing. So for me, it's an ontological and an epistemological perspective that hinges on sensory dynamisms that produce and make space for a variety of subjectivities, intimacies, relationships, and orientations that are non-normative and that are not only about sexuality and gender, but Africana personhood in its multiplicity, and it's grounded in Africana spiritual logics. And I wanted to highlight a few things to really spark our conversation. So Bishop Bernadette is one of my primary interlocutors in my research, and she was sharing her story of how she was called to revival. So she says, I wasn't studying nobody's church. I didn't want to cover up or wear any long clothing or wrap my head. I wanted to be sexy. But the Revival Church is a calling. And one day I bought Juanita Bynum's tapes and I fell in love with the word. So he just poured his word into me through her. So Bishop often talks about Jesus in very sensual terms. So she explained, I don't see him how I see you. I see him in my spirit. I see him in my daily walk. I see him when he touches me. I feel him. He talks to me. We have a relationship. It's like when you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. The closer you get to him, the more you know him. Same with Jesus. If you have a relationship with your boyfriend and he was supposed to come at 8 o'clock, you'd know based on the relationship if he doesn't come, if he's playing a game or not. You could feel him. You can feel when you see him if something is wrong. It's the same thing. I have a relationship with him. So Bishop Bernadette's relationship with Jesus is one instantiation of the multiple modes of intimacies that practitioners experience that are not merely about the search for normative heterosexual coupling, for example. So in March 2019, Bishop Bernadette actually invited me to go with her on one of the quarterly pilgrimages to a place called Watttown in Jamaica. And at Watttown, they have a place called the Jerusalem Schoolroom, which is the headquarters of Jamaican revivalists, where they go there to gain special spiritual sustenance, right? So on the trip, I plan to just stand back as an observer, However, Bishop Bernadette suggested that I fully immerse myself into the experience, and to do so, she would have a uniform made for me. So uniforms are one of the unique characteristics of Revival Zion. Leaders usually receive dream visions from spiritual messengers about the colors and about the style of the uniforms, and it serves as a spiritual cover and a form of protection. And when the spirit messengers see that you've obeyed their instructions and you're sort of in the uniform that they indicated, it pleases them, and thus it builds this trusting, reciprocal kind of relationship where they'll continue to bless and support you. So I was at first really hesitant about having a uniform made for me. I didn't want to feel like an imposter or like I was playing dress up. Bishop Bernadette, however, managed to convince me, although up until the morning of the pilgrimage, as we were fitting the uniforms, I was still pretty nervous, right? And I'll just make myself small so that you can see the pictures of the fitting. So by donning the uniform, I was no longer just a researcher. I was now consenting to a new degree of relational intimacy with my interlocutors. I was to be on one accord with them, and I began experiencing performance anxiety around the myriad embodied codes, genuflections, dances, greetings, songs, and prayers that I might be expected to know, since at least by sight, I was one of them. So I voiced my concerns to Bishop Bernadette and her daughter, Toya. And Toya assured me that I need not worry, because at worst, people would simply assume I was a baby in the spirit. So Bishop Bernadette and Toya fawned over me once the uniforms were on, and they said it suited me and I looked like a doll. So I thanked them, not for the compliment about my appearance, but because instead of feeling like an imposter, through the early morning hours spent dressing and undressing with them, being anointed with oil, prayed over, splashed with Florida water, and nourished with snacks from other revivalists who did not know me, but to whom I was family because of the uniform, I did experience a sense of kinship and belonging. And I just wanted to play a quick clip of sort of this. And we'll pause it right there for the sake of time. But this is just an example of the process of consecrating the uniform, getting anointed before you go to Watttown. So Bishop Bernadette had said, if you want the full experience, you should wear the uniform. Don't be a tourist, be one of us, right? And she was correct. It was as if by transfiguration, the wall between me as a researcher and revivalists as practitioners collapsed. And I too was ushered into this geospiritual space through this Afro-queer mode of orienting. And finally, I highlight this scripture from Jeremiah 8:21-23. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn and horror grips me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is there no healing for the wound of my people? Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. And I want to sit with this for a moment because this verse reverberates hauntingly so, particularly within the African diaspora, as our communities have been forced to reckon over and over and over and over again, weeping for those who are slain in a society where anti-Black violence and disregard for the sanctity of Black life is par for the course. This scripture is one of the most poignant texts that revivalists invoke, particularly the revivalists who belong to what they call the physician's order. So the first time I heard it invoked was when one of my interlocutors exclaimed in anger regarding those who, for Afrophobic reasons, shun revival's healing practices. He says, liars, the whole of them. I know they keep kumina in secret, and kumina is a ritual that calls ancestors. If there's a problem they can't fix, they will keep a kumina to fix it. Yes, we believe in Jesus, but the ancestors work faster. Everybody knows it. They do too. When the Bible says, is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician? Physicians are like revival people and spiritual people who can fix things regular doctors can't. So don't let them fool you saying they don't keep kumina. They do. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to just pause right there and just leave us with that quote. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Dr. Brown, thank you so very much. And again, I want to encourage our audience that we are going to have time at the end for questions, so please put in your questions. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, in your work and the demands of school that Black students are facing, in addition to the fatigue, trauma, anxiety, macro and microaggressions, and just straight up violence related to anti-Black racism, I wonder, in your capacity, both here at UT Austin, but also at Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, what types of resources are you sharing with students, both in terms of biblical, theological resources, but also community resources, campus resources, church resources? What have you been finding that is helpful? What resources have you been finding that are helpful in thinking about this idea of caring for young Black minds and bodies?
Sure. So first of all, thank you all for having me. And I'm just enjoying this conversation with my fellow panelists. And I want to say thank you to everybody for coming out. I think, first of all, one of the things I found is that even in this conversation, if you all haven't picked up on it, there's power in community. And just situating that over and over again. A lot of the struggles that our students are facing, that our faculty and staff are facing as well, are all related to the fact that somehow we've lost that sense of community, and that the isolation that we've experienced over the last 2 years and still going in some cases has led to, higher cases of, students experiencing those anxiety disorders and isolation sickness. And as a result, feeling disconnected from community. So the first thing I tell people is to, be intentional about building your village. One of the things I have a podcast that I host called Building the Village. And I'm constantly reminding people about the power of the village. That ain't something I made up. That ain't something that I came up with within the last 2 years. That's something that came over here with us. We are village people. We are communal people, always have been, always will be. And the thing that I find is that because we've gotten away from that, as a result, we're fractured and we're splintered. And so the first thing I do is talk to students about who's in your village, who are you listening to, who are you paying attention to? That's the first thing. I think the second thing, I also talk about the power of therapy. My wife is a therapist and social worker, and I'm a fan of therapy and therapeutic practices. And I get the sense from my fellow panelists as well that there's power and healing in all of those things. And so I'm constantly reminding students, like, there are people who you can talk to about these things, who will pray on your behalf, who will come and be with you and sit with you, but then also help guide and direct them towards other community resources and opportunities to get connected and help them get an understanding of the experiences that they're going through. And then I also would say, another thing that I think we've lost the ability to do is to seek understanding. And so at UT, in my job at UT, we heavily emphasize intercultural competency, which is the ability to shift perspective and behavior given the context of the communication that you're having. And a lot of the times what we're discovering is that people have just forgotten how to communicate, period. Not just talk to other individuals, but over these last 2 years, especially our high school students that are coming to us and the students that I work with at the church, they can be in a room filled with people but still feel lonely. Be in a room filled with people riding a car to church or riding a car or a bus to school and describe these intense feelings of loneliness and isolation. And so we've forgotten how to communicate. And I think that the skill of intercultural competency is important, because what that's also going to help us do is have these very important conversations that we should be having at the dinner table, and these things that we should be having at our family reunions and at the academy of all places as well. But because we don't emphasize seeking understanding enough, a lot of the times our students are left sitting with their questions and going away and retreating, right? And so I'm really hoping that through the work that I get to do every day at the university and the work that I do at the church, that I'm reminding this up and coming generation and this newer generation of not only middle schoolers and high schoolers, but college students as well, that there's power in community, there's power in the village, there's power in talking to your elders more than anything else. You know, I tell people all the time, I'm like, I don't ever introduce myself as Dr. Jones because I'm from rural East Texas, and ain't nobody gonna call me that back home anyway. So for me, I'm constantly reminding folks, like, look, go spend time with the elderly. They've been where you're trying to go. They know better. You know, I got drugged everywhere by my grandmothers, everywhere. I was at funerals every Saturday with my father's mother, and I was hanging out with the elderly on Sunday after church with my mother's mother. That's how I learned to make sense of the world and the different things that I was experiencing. And that's also, how I came to the Christian faith. And so for me, it's just those things. It's power in therapy, power in the village, power in community, but most of all, intercultural competency and reconnecting with our elderly brothers and sisters, because they're the wise ones and they know a little something. As much as we try to be dismissive at times of their wisdom and experiences, there's a lot of wisdom there that I think that if we can build that bridge and maintain a semblance of who we are, it's through those stories and experiences. So I hope I answered your question.
You sure did. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Or I guess I should say Brandon. Is that what you go by?
I really do. I really do. I don't want no barriers between people wanting to talk.
I try to respect my elders. That's why I say doctor.
It's all good. It's all good. I appreciate it.
But I want to encourage and remind our panelists as we move to our Q&A to try to keep it brief as we receive the questions from our audience. And we are going to make it through a couple of these questions. The first question that I see here is from Donatist. It's actually for Ianaila. Donatist has the question. He says, Ianaila, you said that what you do as a healer, what you do is magical, but it's not magic. Could you explain the distinction between the two?
Sorry, unmute my mic. Thanks for that question. What comes from the spirit realm and what we/I are able to tap into, or that comes through us, is from a higher source, a divine source, or even a natural source. Magic is something for me that is about a trick. So sleight of hand, fooling the eye. I'm from Chicago, so 3-card Monte, that's magic, right? It comes with a trick. But there's no spirit involved in it, not that I know of, or anyone. There's no intentional conjure element, right? And then if we will say ashe, or to me, some primordial power that's associated with it. Okay, so while reaching in my pocket and talking on the phone with someone about manifesting money, and I reach in my pants pocket and all of a sudden there's money there that I didn't realize was there. That may seem magical, but that was profoundly spiritual and divine in a sense. And I use that as an example because that actually just happened a couple of days ago while I was talking to one of my Egg Bay members. And so magic is a trick.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to comment on that question or had any thoughts about that question as well. Okay, so let's move to another question. This question is for Ian, Naila, but also if anyone else would like to answer or think through it as well. Can you tell me of any practices that are done for mothers who lose their children? I'd like to know what is done to care for the mother mentally and ways to help the mother cope with the death of a child.
Oh, wow, that is, that's a deep question. Yes, there are ancestral traditions, both from a continental, if we will, an organic perspective, as well as a diaspora one slash, new world or diaspora world traditions that we have ancestral memory of, a residual memory, but then we evolve them and adapt them to where we are and what we have or didn't have coming over here to wherever here is outside of the continent of Africa. So yes, there are several different types of rituals, ceremonies, and care that are given to not only the mother of having lost a child, but also there are rituals and should be for the fathers as well, because it's not just a woman's loss. It took two people to make that child, and two people lost that child, right? As far as the parents. And then there's also care of the actual, depending on the circumstances of the loss of that new spirit coming into this realm, whether it's like a miscarriage or stillbirth, or abiku, which means a terrible definition of this is born to die. So a child coming in and passing away soon after birth. So yes, I'm not going to go into the specific details of what those are, but there definitely are. But there's also the tradition of preparing the parents, especially the mother, and even more specifically the child before birth, with divination and other ritual practices to inform the mother slash parents of the energies around that birth and that child coming forth. So whether there are some things that need to be done to ensure that the baby comes forth into this realm safely, healthy, and in array, which means, good fortune and balance as far as their destinies are concerned. So, like I said, I'm not going to go into the specifics of what those rituals are because they vary across traditions with each person and situation. So there's a specific spiritual prescription for that person, that mother, and that child, and that family that's specific to them, or should be.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. We have now a question for Dr. Brown, actually, from Selena. The question is, I wonder if Dr. Brown can say more about how Revival Zion engages with history, meaning are one, biblical time, and two, the transatlantic slave trade central, or are there also ways of thinking about spiritual lands that might relate to other moments in African or global history?
Thank you for that wonderful question. So yeah, absolutely. So the way that revivalists engage with a part of their sort of whole spiritual realm, their spiritual universe, is really interesting because the way that time works is not in sort of the linear fashion that we normally think of time in sort of our Western understanding of time. And so a lot of the ways that they envision time is sort of everything happening at once, right? But at the same time, through the practices that they do, through these spiritual journeys, through ancestral work in particular, they often tap into sort of the African spiritual realm. And through this African spiritual realm is a lot of where these notions around some of their practices around trans journeys, around spirit possession, around certain kinds of healing practices, talk about sort of transatlantic slavery, the legacies of that, and then how they account for that within their practices, such as, notions around your spirit being able to fly back back to Africa is one example, for example, of how people engage with these notions of time, as well as a large part of the work that I do is also thinking about futurity and Afrofuturism and how that plays out in Revival Zion through the way that people are able to imagine new kinds of futures through this sort of expansive way that they think about dimension, through this expansive way in which they think about time, through this expansive way in which they think about the ways that our bodies and our spirits can move through time and space. And also on that question around history as well, one of the things that I wanted to also highlight is, I saw another question in the chat that Neria responded to around the sanctity of female and male in African philosophy, and whether or not, and someone finding it disrespectful, I guess, to talk about queerness in that space. And one of the things that I do want to say as it relates to history, Neria gave a really good answer. And, she mentioned the fact that, it was about respecting other people's beliefs. But one of the things that I want to do as a researcher is to point out that it's not even only about beliefs, but the data doesn't prove it out that, for example, in African ancestral histories, people did not have these creative notions of gender and sexuality. And one of the ways that I do my work is through tapping into emic Revival Zion understanding of history, right? And so one of the things that they understand is that expansive gender identities are actually coming from ancestral spirits. So a lot of the way that they even understand it is they will say to you that ancestral spirits give you queerness as a gift. And through inhabiting this kind of liminal space, those are the people who are the seers, those are the people who are the sort of creative mediums who can interact with time and space and bend it in particular kinds of way. And so a lot of the research, and I really think that's important to point out, because a lot of the research that I do, both the archival research and actually looking at people's lives, sort of the narrative of certain kinds of Afrocentric philosophies tries to argue that sort of queerness is this Western neoliberal kind of imposition. But in reality, when we look at the data, when we look at the history, when we look at people's lived experiences, what we realize is that Afrophobia, the fear and suspicion of things that are African, as well as homophobia, often are two intertwined things that go together. And so where you see the fear and suspicion of things that are African is also where you see a lot of that homophobia also playing out as well. And so within Revival Zion in particular, through recuperating ancestral history is where people actually find that space to talk about the myriad historical ways that Africans have embraced and accepted multiple forms of gender and sexual expressions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. We have a question now from Deja. Deja has a question about hoodoo. In thinking about hoodoo, would folk magic be the correct term, or would ancestral conjure be more suited? This is a question about how can we identify this particular religious tradition?
I have to agree that I've never been fond of the term folk magic. I think ancestral conjure would be a better fit, just because I feel like it fully, one, respects the tradition in terms of language, but also is more accurate in a description. But you'll hear a lot of people call it a lot of things. I think it's just a matter of what sits right with you and your ancestors and your spiritual community. There's a lot of different language out there, though.
Thank you so much. We have another question for Dr. Brown. If you have I see your camera's off, so maybe.
Yes.
Okay. So the question actually deals with this idea of Afroqueer. Are you able to provide maybe one or two examples of Afroqueerness in other spiritual practices across the diaspora?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the so outside of Revival Zion, for example, one of the best examples that I also find that I also really like is looking at Haitian Vodou, right? And thinking about sort of when I talk about these multidimensional, multi-sensual, these non-normative subjectivities, these non-normative ways of having intimacy through the act of spiritual mounting, through spirit possession in Haitian Vodou, you also see this kind of bending of the normative rules, right? So for example, when people attend Fête Guédés, which is for the Lua, which are particular spirits in Haitian Vodou, you see the fact that women can be possessed by male spirits, men can be possessed by female spirits. And when you're possessed in that kind of way, you take on the characteristics of that spirit. So whether or not you're a man, whether or not you're a woman, in that sort of spiritual exercise, in that spiritual experience, you're able to sort of bend the normative ways in which you would normally sort of display your gender. And this is a common practice within Fête Guédé, within Haitian Vodou, within a lot of other African diaspora religions where this has always been the case. And so that's just one other example, specifically in Haitian Vodou, where we see these ways that, you know, certain kinds of Lua are also said to be the keepers of people who can inhabit these multiple gender and sexual identities.
Thank you so much. The next question is actually for whoever would like to answer this question. So Flora asks, because the majority of our traditions, African diasporic traditions, religious traditions are oral, and we are a generation of the written word, picture, video, please give your perspective on how we can move forward as the people, as our people look to move back to traditional faiths using modern methods.
I'm happy to jump in if I can. So this is something that I get questions about a lot, especially when you're involved with Ile and Egbe or other spiritual houses and spaces, is that everybody wants to read things in books or on the internet, or if you do come across things in books or the internet, I always caution folks that consider the source, consider the ulterior motives of the, potential ulterior motives of the source of that content. And then also our ancestral traditions, our organic ancestral traditions, whether from the continent or in aspects of the diaspora, are lived. We tend to use the contemporary Western term practice. Our traditions are lived. So in order to get the full extent of the power, the primordial power of them, is to live them. So reading about something, whether it's on the internet or in a book, is okay, because that gives you, fills in the blanks of some things and helps, and everything can be helpful in its proper context. But in order to, however, in order to really fully access our ancestral traditions, one must live them in your daily lives. So there are nuances, and there's also awo, mystery, secret, that is not intended, nor should they be in books or written down. If they are, again, violation of some taboos or protocols, but also consider the source. Because just because something's written down or in a form that uses one side of our intellect, is not all that there is to learning, living, and engaging in our ancestral traditions. So that's why we have elders and eldresses to guide us, right? To bring us along. Like Brother Dr. Brandon said, he was drug along by his grandparents or his grandmothers to everything. So those experiences or insperiences that he received could not be duplicated in any other way, tangible way, than for him to have lived them. Okay.
Thank you, Ian Aila. And for the sake of time, we'll actually do one more question. This final question is for Brandon. The question has to do with, let me pull it up here. If you might be able to speak a little bit more about specific programs, activities that you've led at GMZ, Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church, or even here on campus to help rebuild those villages that you were talking about that have been impacted by the pandemic.
Sure. So one of the things that we started doing over the last couple of years at Greater specifically was our partnership with Houston Tillotson University. We want to be a good partner in the community of Austin, specifically where we're situated in East Austin. And so for us, our Pastor Clark is always asking the question, if this building burned down today, would the community miss it? And so if the answer is no, then we don't really have an impact there. And so one of the first things we wanted to make sure that we did was that we're working with Houston Tillotson and we're providing scholarships. So every year I was responsible for making sure that with meeting with our budget committee, meeting with President Burnett, shout out to Dr. Burnett getting ready to retire, their job well done at HT, making sure that students could afford to pay for school. So we started with that. And then we provided need-based scholarships for our students that were going off to college or trade school or pursuing different post-high school options, because college isn't the only option. I think the second one is being very intentional about who we bring in. We don't just present one option to our students. We're very big on exposure. And so we don't just take our students on college visits. We take them to the Carver Library. We take them downtown to Google and Facebook. We expose them to different industries so that by the time that they're graduating from high school, they've got options and they're not just being pigeonholed into one direction and being made to feel like they're less than simply because they're not going to college or even pursuing the family faith for that matter. We sit down and we openly and honestly sit down and talk to our students about things that they're encountering, things that they're experiencing in the world, and informing in a very unbiased way, understanding that they're going to go off in the world and learn different things. And so as it comes back to rebuilding the villages impacted through the pandemic, it's actually being out there in the community. Next week, we're doing our Love Our City initiative, where you're going to be seeing members of our church in the community paying for gas at gas stations. We're going to be planting gardens in the community. We'll be providing some different services and resources. My wife and I also, with my wife being a therapist and a social worker, just making sure that we're connecting people to the resources and the things that they need on an individual level just to live, because that's how we express our faith practice. We believe it's rooted in service, but more importantly, rooted in love. And so the different initiatives that we participate in, not only at the church, but also in the community, in the social circles that we reside in, just making sure that we're really living that out and not just talking about it or preaching about it from a pulpit on Sunday. I hope that answered the question.
It sure did. Thank you, each of our panelists. Thank you to our attendees, those who are watching live and also the recording. This was such a good discussion, and I'm grateful for each of you for your contribution. We hope that you all can join us for any of the events that are going on throughout the rest of the day for Black Religions and Spirituality Day. Take care and have a safe day.